people embrace a religion that has been racialized, and what happens more specifically when they take on the visible attributes of this religion. So basically the question I'm trying to answer is, over history, when was conversion interpreted not solely in terms of betraying religious values, but also in terms of changing one's racial status? In short, when did religious apostasy equate racial crossing? And I argue that the answer we're going to find will enable us to pinpoint the racial dimension and the racial component of Islamophobia. So in terms of method, I am not a historian, so for the historical part I will rely on historical secondary sources, especially this very good book called Les Chrétiens d'Allah, the Christians of Allah, although the title is a little weird, but it's basically an investigation of conversion to Islam in the 16th and 17th century, and these two historians used the records of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition that had to investigate cases of apostasy, so people who moved from Christianity to Islam. So it's a very rich historical material. And then for the contemporary period, I rely on qualitative methods. So I've been conducting interviews with converts in France and the US, so 40 in the US and 42 in France. And then there's also an ethnographic component to my research, although I won't have the time to talk about it, where I did field work in convert supergroups in France and the United States. Okay, so let me move to the result, and let's start with the 16th century. So not a lot of people know that between 1500 and 1750, hundreds of thousands of European Christians forcibly or voluntarily converted to Islam in Morocco and the Ottoman regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. So the geopolitical context at that time was completely different from today. So the Ottoman Empire was extremely powerful, and in order to gain financial autonomy, the regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli turned to piracy. So they started attacking European ships on the Mediterranean, and the Europeans did the same. So the Mediterranean was this massive commercial battlefield. Now the European Christians who were taken as captives in North Africa were most of the time enslaved, and in order to gain their freedom, they had to convert to Islam. So if you become a Muslim, then you could be free. We also had a lot of people who converted for business reasons. So the North African society at that time was thriving, and it was very easy to do business. Then you have people who converted because, well, they thought Islam was the truth. So people converted for a large number of reasons. Now these people who converted were called renegades, and they were stigmatized for having renounced Christianity. Some of them were very famous. So this is Jacques Santi, who came from Corsica and who became a famous renegade by the name of Mourad Bey, and he was actually one of the first Bey of Tunis in 1630. So it's interesting to see how these renegades were perceived in the European imagination at that time. What's particularly interesting is that conversion to Islam was depicted in racial terms. So the people who converted were accused of having turned Turk or become Moor. You also had a lot of theater plays in that period about renegades. One of them was called A Christian Turned Turk by Robert Billboard. So really, you had this emphasis on racial betrayal that was very much present. The other thing that's interesting is the emphasis on clothing. So the passage from Christianity to Islam was depicted through the lexical field of clothing. So the converts were accused of having taken the turban. They had been seen on the street dressed as Moors. So you really have this emphasis on outward appearance, on the body, on body ornaments, to decide who was Muslim and who was not. And actually, the inquisitors used costume and fashion as evidence that someone had left Christianity for Islam. You also had a lot of cases of racial passing. So one of the most famous cases was Francisco Gicardo, aka Ali Rais. So the renegades who were arrested by the Inquisition were judged for apostasy, for having left Christianity. So one of the strategies that they used was to say that they had never been Christians. They had been born as Muslims and as Turkish people. So Ali Rais really insisted on the fact that he was Turkish. He said, God made me a Turk and I will die as a Turk. So you had this interesting case of racial passing, a little bit like Rachel Dolezal case back in the 17th century. And so inquisitors actually had to stay on the racial identity of the renegades before making that judgment. So renegades were also prominent in the American imaginary at that time. So a lot of Americans were held captives in North Africa, and captivity narratives became a very famous literary genre in that period. And what's interesting is that the word renegade applied as much to the people who converted to Islam in North Africa as to the people who had gone native among local Native Americans. So in both cases, it was interpreted as this type of racial crossing and racial betrayal. Okay, now let me jump 2 centuries ahead and move to the French colonial period in Algeria, which was also decisive in the genealogy of racialized Islamophobia. So as you know, the colonized people in Algeria were called Français musulmans, or French Muslims, but they were French only by name, obviously, because they didn't have the same rights as the citizen of mainland France. And the distinction between French Muslims and French citizens was really more racial than religious. In fact, in 1903, a group of Algerians decided to convert to Catholicism, and they say, hey, we are not Muslims anymore, so can we be Frenchmen? And the French Supreme Court actually refused by saying, well, in fact, the category Muslim is not really confessional, but it refers to the status you acquire at birth. So really you have this idea that Islam was racialized as antithetical to whiteness and to Frenchness. So again, religious conversion was important in that process. So I'm interested in what happened to the Europeans who decided to embrace Islam at that period where precisely religious boundaries were becoming more and more rigidified. So one of them was Philippe Grenier. So Philippe Grenier was a doctor in a very small town of eastern France called Pontarlier, and he converted to Islam in 1894 after a trip to Algeria. And 2 years later, he was elected member of parliament. Now, what's interesting is that he was the first Muslim to step foot in the French parliament, and he would go there dressed with the traditional Algerian dress, which is quite incredible when you think about it. That would never happen again today. But so Philippe Grenier was depicted in the newspaper as this kind of eccentric, extravagant man, and he was called Mr. Arab by everybody. In the US, you had a similar case. His name was Alexander Russell Webb, and he converted to Islam in 1888 after a trip to the Philippines, where he was an ambassador, and then he came back to the United States to promote Islam. And it's also very interesting to see how he was depicted in the newspapers at that time. So this is a quote from the New York Times, who said, "His skin is tanned, and there is about him, especially in his movements, an oriental air. His face is almost dark enough for him to be mistaken for a light Hindu, and he talks with a slight foreign accent. With a fez, he could easily pass for a Mohammedan." So there's a lot to unpack in that quote, and I don't have the time to do so, but clearly if Webb had not been Muslim, his racial identity, his mastery of the English language would probably never have been questioned. But somehow, because he was Muslim, he had kind of crossed this racial boundary. And again, you see here the importance of clothing, the importance of the turban and outward appearance in the way he's described. I want to talk more about the importance of clothing, but I'm not sure I have the time. But a very good movie for that is Lawrence of Arabia. I suggest you watch it again if you already watched it. So there are 2 scenes in the movie that are particularly interesting. In the first one, T.E. Lawrence is dressed as an Arab, and so he encounters a British officers who calls him a filthy little wog and slaps him in the face. And then in the next sequence, he sees the same British officer who actually does not recognize him, and he's very polite towards him. So I think this says something about the importance of clothing. And now I want to conclude by talking about the depiction of Muslim converts in France and the United States today. So here are a few numbers about converts in these 2 countries, although I'm not sure they are reliable, so I should maybe not show them. And so how are converts racialized and perceived today? The blogger Ben Gregory, who is a convert to Islam, has made a list of all the racial identities that people assign to him. So he has a picture of how he looked like as a kid and how he looks like today. So again, you see the importance of the beard and the kufi, and he has been racialized as Middle Eastern, Turkish, Syrian, Lebanese, Iranian, Afghani, Pakistani, Bosnian, Chechen, Malaysian, and black. So here again, the beard and the kufi is prominent as far as men are concerned, and obviously as far as women are concerned, the hijab, the headscarf, is a very effective, powerful factor of racialization. So this is an interview I did with Lisa, who is a white girl of Polish descent, who converted to Islam a couple of years ago and who recently decided to put on the headscarf. And when I asked her how she is perceived by society, she said, I'm definitely perceived as a woman of color, which is so insane to go through. As a white person, I think very few white people ever had that experience. It's really strange because sometimes when I enter a discussion, people a little bit older convince themselves that I have an accent. So you have this interesting cognitive process whereby what you see affects what you hear, which is a little bit strange, but to use a metaphor by W.E.B. Du Bois, we can say that the female converts who put on the headscarf come under the veil, both in the literative sense, that they put a veil on their head, but also in the figurative sense, in the sense that they cross a racial divide. So most of the time, the fact that people assign racial identities to them is pretty funny for converts, but sometimes it can be very traumatic because they experience racism really for the first time in their lives. So you have people who've been called the N-word. I've interviewed people who've been called Sen nigger, which is an insult I didn't know. And in French, bougnoul, which is a very derogatory word for Arabs. Okay, let me finish this. And then the most recent development in the perception of converts is obviously the trope of terrorism and racialization. Now, what's particularly interesting is that in the mainstream media, there is this fetishization or romanticization of white converts who have joined the ranks of radical Islamist groups. So they give to these converts nicknames, titles, such as the White Widow, Lady Jihad, the American Taliban, and they talk about Blue-Eye Jihad and the White Army of Terror. So this trope of homeland security and terrorism is now extremely prominent in the perception and racialization of converts. Okay, let me conclude now. So I used conversion to Islam almost as a live experiment to see racialization in the making and investigate in real time how racial identity is affected by religious conversion. So converts to Islam have been called a lot of names through history, so Turks, Moors, Arabs, Mahometan, Hindu, niggers, and niggers, and bougnoul. And so there was always some form of racialization and otherization involved. However, the meaning of that racialization has changed over time. So in the period of the renegades, where the Ottoman Empire was very prominent, there was a lot of anxiety generated by conversion to Islam, especially because you didn't have so many people who converted from Islam to Christianity. And so it was really interpreted as this form of racial treason. In the colonial period, where Europeans were dominant, there was this form of exotification and Orientalism surrounding converts, who were really seen as this kind of eccentric, weird people. And then in the contemporary period, there is the trope of terrorism, which is extremely present. So I didn't talk too much about gender, I didn't talk too much about the differences between France and the United States. And then I didn't talk too much about white privilege. I don't want to make it seem that these white converts become completely racialized as other, because that's not true. Okay, they retain a significant amount of white privilege, especially in the Muslim community. I don't have the time to talk about that, but I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you also for sticking to the time. Our next presenter is Zoya Islam. Zoya is a graduate student at Queen's University. She's working towards achieving her MA degree in gender studies. and she is currently in the research and writing phase. Her thesis inquires into how the garment industry in Bangladesh is understood within the borders of Canada. In her spare time, she acts as a moderator and content curator for Guerrilla Feminism Canada's social media platforms. She has worked with several organizations, including Canadian Women's Foundation, YWCA Toronto, Outburst, Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic, and the Institute for Educational Development at Brock University. Zoya's paper today is entitled Canada, Muslims in Canada, an examination of Muslim exceptionalism through the discourses surrounding honor violence and female genital mutilation. Zoya.
Hi everyone. Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be here on your beautiful campus among such brilliant scholars. How many Canadians are there here today? Could you raise your hand? Oh, quite a few of us, yeah? Awesome. Yes, my paper is titled Muslim in Canada, an examination of Muslim exceptionalism through popular discourses surrounding honor violence and female genital mutilation, or FGM. Storytelling is a powerful tool. Narrative has the capacity to shape our world as states use strategic narratives as a tool to articulate their interests, values, and aspirations for their desired international order. Our world order has been constructed by stories. Stories that have been told about humanity to dictate who can belong and who must be marginalized. Essentially, the social construct of race is an elastic tool that serves the processes of colonialism, power, and capital accumulation. These stories of dehumanization have been systematically institutionalized and are now considered as objective norms. According to Sylvia Winter, a socially constructed hierarchy of humanity has been established, resulting in systemic marginalization of racialized peoples that are identified as subhuman. In this hierarchy, Indigenous and Black peoples are placed at the bottom, while those closer to whiteness experience racialization on a sliding scale. As I'm sure you understand, this organizing principle, coupled with the phenomenon of Orientalism, is used for the purposes of colonialism. Although Winter speaks specifically to the dehumanization of Black and Indigenous peoples, her argument can be extended to the dehumanization of all Muslims within the Canadian state, which is what I do here in this project. Once normal humanness is defined by the state, the other is constructed in opposition. This normal humanness is ostensibly expressed by and embodied in white people of the West. These racist logics of the other serve to promote the whiteness of the Canadian state through canonized whiteness. I want to quickly note that this presentation in no way whatsoever advocates for Muslim assimilation into Canadian society, because I believe that assimilation is always predicated on exclusion, nor does it assume that these degrees of racialization, like Black, Indigenous, and Muslim, are mutually exclusive categories. This will make more sense later. So the myth of anti-racism in Canada. Canada is praised for its supposed success story with multiculturalism. Many Canadians assume that multiculturalism promotes inclusivity and discourages racism, as the adoption of a multiculturalist policy promotes the idea that Canada is cutting edge and promoting a racial tolerance. Right? We're nice people. We say sorry and we say thank you. Well, we can be nice and we can be racist too. We're nice racists. Sunera Tobani argues that Canada perceives itself as a nation consisting of responsible, compassionate, caring citizens who are committed to the values of diversity and multiculturalism. Therefore, Canada, on the global scale, is constructed to be anti-racist and a welcoming nation that espouses dignity. However, this very imagined construct is founded upon racist principles and enormous acts of violence upon racialized people. Immigrants in Canada are seen as importing their backwards cultural practices into the country, so-called backward cultural practices such as honor killing. The rampant Islamophobia in Canada serves to exclude Muslims from Canadian national belonging. Muslim exceptionalism has sparked policy debates regarding civil liberties, secularism, security, and multiculturalism. In the past year, Canada has also seen an escalation of Islamophobia and fear-mongering in Canada. Politicians and the media have used fear-mongering the fear of Muslims as a political tool in our federal election, there have been legislative changes that reflect this. We're not too different from the US in this sense. So in this presentation, I will discuss how Muslims in Canada have been dehumanized and categorized as irrational, deviant subjects by critically analyzing the discourses surrounding honor killing and female genital mutilation. I inquire into how these logics serve to exclude Muslim bodies within the Canadian nation-state and continue to institutionalize whiteness. Note that I posit from the beginning that this master code of who is human must be deconstructed in order for real systems change to occur. So in regards to the structure of this presentation, firstly, I will briefly explain the concepts of Muslim exceptionalism, honor violence, and genital mutilation. Secondly, I will examine the language used by academics, activists, and the Government of Canada to condemn Muslims for honor-related violence and female genital mutilation by employing Sylvia Wynter's theoretical approach. Thirdly, I will ask how these discourses serve to preserve the whiteness of the state by excluding Muslims and discouraging multiculturalism and immigration. I ask, what are the implications of the mobilization against honor killings and female genital mutilation? What role do conversations about multiculturalism and immigration serve in reproducing the racial narratives of Muslim peoples? So the Canadian government has allowed for a state of exceptionalism with Muslims in Canada. This exceptionalism is justified through portraying Canada as in a state of emergency, thus warranting the suspension of Muslim people's rights. When communities are without the rights to have rights, they are considered different from marginalized communities. They belong to a different order of humanity altogether because of the absolute absence of a political community to grant them rights. Thus, the nation does not fret for this group without rights. This expulsion of Muslim peoples strengthens the whiteness of the nation-state. We can now see that the war on terror has allowed such a state of exception to be imposed on Muslims suspected of links to terrorism in Canada as elsewhere, such that the suspension of law has allowed the introduction of measures previously deemed outside the judicial order. Therefore, the racialization of Muslims as terrorists, in other words, Islamophobia in Canada, justifies the suspension of law and revoking of legal rights even today. The dangerous Muslim man who threatens the West is depicted as a monster terrorist and called an Islamic extremist. This danger is made believable largely through the appeal to racist narratives about intrinsically savage, pre-modern Muslims. This image is something I'm sure all scholars in this room are familiar with. This racist narrative reflects the Western understanding of being human and being moral, as the white man has been constructed through secularization and modernization, in opposition to the supposedly savage, misogynistic, and pre-modern racialized peoples. Sylvia Wynter identifies how this dichotomy of the human and subhuman and the understanding of racial superiority is constructed. The so-called secular subject invokes a normal humanness, which is associated with white people in the West, thus situating the human other as non-evolved and backwards. Muslims, of course, fall under the latter. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what honor killing is, or how it's been defined. It's been defined as the killing of a woman by her relatives for violation of a sexual code in the name of restoring family honor. It is marked as a culturally specific form of violence, distinct from other widespread forms of domestic or intimate partner violence, including the more familiar passion crime. Although it is widely assumed that honor killing is part of Islam, neither the values nor its enforcement through violence are condoned by Islam. However, the racialized association of honor killing with the Middle East and South Asia end up associating it with Islam. Canadian understanding of honor killing is based on racist narratives of Islam as a backward religion, contradictory to the values espoused by Canadians. However, in reality, honor killing is simply a racialized interpretation of violence against women, because when you think about it, you see that all violence against women is honor-related violence. This is one of the many ways in which Muslim women's bodies and their safety and rights have been co-opted by Western thought. Muslim women, ironically, are simultaneously portrayed to be a threat to democracy and Western civilization, as well as victims who need to be rescued. These racialized discourses about honor killing advocate for the exclusion of Muslim bodies from the Canadian state, which I'm going to talk more about soon. So, female genital mutilation, or FGM. A couple of notes. The understanding of FGM follows the Western epistemological order, otherwise known as the categorization of human, which I was referring to earlier. as it considers the morality of practices against a Western set of norms that are considered as objective fact. Amnesty International reports that FGM is predominantly practiced in African and Middle Eastern communities. The World Health Organization defines FGM as all procedures involving partial or total removal of the female external genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. Interestingly, FGM is condemned as immoral and barbaric, while male circumcision is treated as a completely normal and acceptable practice. Please note that I'm not condoning FGM in my presentation, nor am I commenting on the morality of it myself. I'm simply analyzing how the West has falsely associated this practice with Islam and used it as a way to vilify Muslim communities. The hypocrisy of it all. Canada, along with many other nations, is suffering from an epidemic of violence against women. In 2011, from the 89 police-reported spousal homicides, 76 of the victims, which is over 85%, were women. Recently, there have been countless and missing murdered Indigenous women, in addition to the atrocities committed upon women's bodies in our history. Thus, we can see that violence against women is a big problem in Canada. Despite the very real existence of violence against women in Canada, the nation tends to portray itself as ascribing to women's equality and granting greater rights to women than others. The non-West is routinely presented as the preeminent site for terrible gender oppression and violence against women, where forced marriages, dowry debts, honor killings, genital mutilation, and other such practices are said to characterize women's lives. These representations make Canada appear to be a safe haven for women, where gender-based violence is practically non-existent by default. And as such, the normative narrative suggests that gender-based violence, such as honor killings and genital mutilation, are acts of barbarism perpetrated exclusively by Muslim peoples. Ironically, the very existence of the Canadian state is founded upon terrible acts of violence against Black and Indigenous women. So, a prominent and notoriously Islamophobic, quote-unquote, educator named Aruna Pop has created works on honor violence that have had enormous influence in Canada. Media outlets love to turn to Pop's work because it really panders to the fear of Muslims and the racialization of South Asian folks at large. Pop defines honor-related violence as a violent and clandestine ancient cultural practice that informs the lives of South Asian immigrant women and girls in Canada. I pay specific attention to the work of Pop because it has been lauded by Canadian organizations, institutions, and the media, because it is politically useful to do so. According to Pop, this culturally driven violence is differentiated from Western domestic violence, which is, by comparison, statistically infrequent and reproached by Canadian society at large. Pop's work is premised upon racist, dichotomous descriptions of the civilized West and barbaric non-West. This logic is based on the popular racist narrative of Muslim men as barbaric and violent towards Muslim women. Of course, this discourse is convenient to the state as it promotes the imperialist logic behind the heinous acts that Canada and the US wage upon the Middle East, using the logic of saving Muslim women. We can see that Muslim women's bodies are consistently used as a colonizing tool. And so we can also see that the strategy of protecting and saving women from particular forms of violence, like honor killing, reproduces tools for national governance and control. In reality, returning to the topic of racialized honor violence, I argue that all violence against women is honor-related violence. Let's get some perspective on the issue of honor killing in Canada using some stats. In Canada, a woman is killed every 6 to 7 days by a partner or an ex. It is now estimated that there are over 1,200 cases of missing or murdered Indigenous women, half of them since the year 2000. There has been a reported between 10 to 16 murders categorized as honor-related in Canada since 2001. Last year, our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, inferred that certain Islamic practices are rooted in an anti-woman culture. Well, sorry, Steve, but as you can see, it's Canada that has an anti-woman culture. Pop's discourse differentiates honor killing as a different form of violence, as she insists that acts of gender-based violence in the West are statistically infrequent and deplored and challenged by Canadian society, and that many white Canadian men are devoted to gender inequality and do not subscribe to the same logic of patriarchy that South Asian immigrant men are deeply invested in. Of course, we know this to be simply untrue, it's just racialized logic. But by differentiating patriarchal violence between South Asians and Muslims and Canadian men, Pop notes a difference between rational humans and irrational animals, which is mapped as a space of otherness. Tobani argues that exaltation is key to the creation of a particular national subject, or the human, if you will. Western ontologies have been based in binary constructions of the self being constituted in relation to its excluded other. Thus, by setting up this juxtaposition between white men and South Asian immigrant men, Pop herself is exalting the white national subject. Considering crimes of honor killing as foreign in nature promotes ideologies of cultural superiority and redraw the civilizational line between an inherently violent and barbaric Muslim East and a democratic, gender-equal, and non-violent secular West. Viewing honor killing as foreign, when in reality, all violence against women is about honor, promotes the ideas of racial superiority. The reality is that honor killing is just a racialized understanding of violence against women. It's only considered foreign in nature because it is compared to the norm that has been established according to the racist narratives of the human. It seems barbaric in comparison when in reality, all forms of violence are monstrous. The story that is being told serves a specific purpose, to racialize and exclude Muslim bodies from the nation state. Some of you might have heard of a bill which was recently passed in Canada called the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices. This bill, or Bill 7, deliberately panders to the fear of Canadians who fear Muslim immigrants. This bill intends to curb practices such as honor killing, even though they are already